We are doing section 6.3, and this is part 1. There will be 2 parts to this section. Alright, so our learning target for part 1 is perform operations. And remember, operations in math, the 4 basic ones are addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. And we're going to do this on functions. Okay. Alright, now before we start on that, I need to define something called a power function. And you've been working with these in the last couple sections with your exponents, but it's defined like this: a times x to the b power, and a is a real number, and b is a rational number. And remember from our last sections, that means it can be written as a fraction. So a lot of the exponents will be fractions. So an example of a power function might look something like this: 3 times x raised to the 5/6 power. Okay, so now we are going to do our operations on functions. And you've been doing this for a long time, but it's in a little bit different context. We're using our function notation. And we're going to work through each one here. So we're going to start out by letting our first function, f of x, equal 3x. And our g of x is going to equal x plus 3. Alright, so if we do addition with these two functions and we add them together, we would just have 3x plus x plus 3. And we would just combine our like terms and get 4x plus 3. So nothing new here, it just looks a little bit different. And it does have a purpose that we'll show later. So now if I subtract these two functions, I would have 3x minus x plus 3. I'm subtracting this whole function, so I need to put it in parentheses because remember, there's a -1 in front of the parentheses, and when you do the distributive property, that's going to change both the signs. Okay. So we would end up with 2x minus 3. Alright, let's keep going, and we'll do multiplication and division. So now if we multiply these two functions, we would have 3x times x plus 3, and we need to do the distributive property, and we would get 3x squared plus 9x. Alright, let's look at the division. Okay, so we're going to do division just like a fraction. Remember, the fraction bar means to divide. So we're not going to do long division or anything like that. We're just going to write it as a fraction. Now, in division, we have to think about what would cause us to divide by 0, because remember, that's undefined. And so we need to take care of this. We need to talk about something called the domain. And when you talk about the domain, you're thinking about what are the possible values of x. to say that, are there any values of x that wouldn't work? And so in the case of a fraction, since we can't divide by 0, we need to think about what value would make that a 0 in the denominator. So you can probably do this in your head, but we would realize that x equals -3, since -3 plus +3 would equal 0 would not be allowed. So in your homework and on tests, they're going to ask you, what is the domain? And what you're going to say, and I just use a big D for the domain, it can be any real number, and I use this capital R with an extra bar to represent real numbers, except x equals -3. That one is not allowed since you can't divide by 0. Okay, we'll talk about domain some more in other problems too. Okay, so I'm going to do 2 more examples. And this time, let's use some of the power functions. So f of x is going to equal 3x to the 1/2 power. And g of x is going to equal 5x to the 1/2 power. Okay, so if we add these together, now this is where the section 1 and section 2 in this chapter are going to come in. These are like terms. They're both the 1/2 power on the x, so we can just add the numbers in front. Okay, let's look at subtraction with these two. So now I'm going to subtract f of x minus g of x. So same thing, they're like terms, but I'm subtracting. So I get -2x to the 1/2 power. Now remember from the last sections, the 1/2 power is the same as the square root. And you remember that you can't take the square root of a negative number. You would get an imaginary number. It won't be a real number answer. So we need to talk about the domain again here. If you have an even root, so an even number in this denominator, you can only do positive real numbers. So I would just write it like that, positive reals. So if it would have been to the 1/4 power or the 1/6 power, again you would just write positive real numbers for the domain. Let's look at one more example with multiplying and dividing. So we're going to let f of x equal 7x and g of x equal x to the 1/6 power. So if we multiply these two functions, now remember when you multiply, you add the exponents. The exponent on this x is a 1. So then I would do 1 plus 1/6. And 1 can be written as 6 over 6 plus 1 over 6. And that would give me 7 over 6. Okay, all right, let's do a division. And again, we're just going to write that as a fraction. So I'd have 7x over x to the 1/6 power. This time I'm going to subtract my exponents. So I'd have 1 minus 1/6. And again, I'll write 1 as 6 over 6 minus 1 over 6. And I would end up with 7x to the 5 over 6 power. And since the denominator here is 6, that means the 6th root And since it's even, I would have to say in the domain, the only x values that are allowed would be positive real numbers. Okay, that's the end of part 1.